Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you all today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients to help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats and improve their cyber maturity. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll be able to find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions anytime, and we'll address questions at the end. Just a quick intro into who Kroll is. Kroll is in a unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. We have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes and with a variety of industries. We work with over 80 cyber insurance carriers as well. This gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on the front lines. My name is George Glass. I'm a Senior Vice President in the Cyber Risk Practice, responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform, used to power our managed detection response service to clients around the globe. Joining me on this deep dive into the MOVEit exploitation is Scott Downey. Scott is an Associate Managing Director who leverages more than 20 years of computer networking and information security experience, including 15 years specializing in computer forensics for the FBI. Scott's primary focus at Kroll is helping clients with a wide range of cyber-related matters through advanced investigative digital forensics and intrusion response-related work, encompassing both on-site and remote digital evidence collection, triage, and in-depth analysis. So what are we going to cover in this session? Well, we're going to start with a backstory behind the MOVEit exploit. We're going to look at lessons learned and how organizations can minimize impact for any further such intrusions down the line. So first of all, let's get an idea of the backstory behind the MOVEit campaign. Who are the actors involved? What happened? The CLOP ransomware group, also identified as TA505 or Fin11, has continued to pose a significant threat, and that is absolutely so in 2023. They're primarily known these days for targeting managed file transfer or MFT solutions, and the group has been very active this year, exploiting vulnerabilities with MOVEit, of course, but also Go Anywhere file transfer software as well. CLOP is a prolific and mainstay of the threat landscape for years, delivering malware via email spamming and spear phishing campaigns in the past, using a number of different phishing techniques, many of which are form a trend for the ongoing year of how these mal spam and spear phishing campaigns would be delivered. CLOP was known to deliver a wide variety of initial access malware. Some of the malwares that they used include flawed Grace Rat, which then led to CLOP ransomware encryption for impact. That left a .clop file extension and a CLOP ransom README note. CLOP also operated a double extortion methodology whereby they would exfil data as well as encrypt it for impact, and then post victims to their extortion site on the darknet, which is known as CLOP leaks. After a number of members of CLOP were arrested in 2019, the group since then has tended to favor data exfil and extortion only, as opposed to their previous double extortion tactics. They've demonstrated the ability to develop and use zero and end day vulnerabilities against MFT services, which host highly confidential PII data, typically often used in business-to-business transactions as well. Over the years, they've famously exploited vulnerabilities in Acelion, SolarWinds ServU, Go Anywhere, all of which have affected hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations. As you can see from the graph on the right there, during Q2 of this year, CLOP ransomware cases made up 37% of our ransomware incident response engagements. And of course, that is down to the MOVEit exploitation that the group was doing around that time. So let's get an overview of what happened with CLOP's exploitation of MOVEit before Scott gets further into detail shortly. MOVEit is an MFT application developed by Progress Software, allowing for businesses to share information and files. This is typically used by the legal sector, other professional services firms, to share PII information. Some of that may or not include payroll, legal documents, scans of passports, so all very, very sensitive data. On May 31st, Kroll began receiving reports of a campaign to exploit a vulnerability in MOVEit. At the time, no ransom notes were left on the devices, but there was evidence that data had been exfiltrated. Exploitation appeared to be deliberately timed to take place over the Memorial Day holiday in the US, with exploit starting on or around the 27th of May. On June 6th, CLOP then further took responsibility for the attacks, stating that victims would be contacted with ransom demands on June 14th. And you can see the post on the right there, which is a screenshot from the CLOP data leak site. Of course, they must have known at that point that it was going to take them time to go through all of the data that they'd collected over their short campaign. During our investigation, we found that CLOP had likely been developing this ODay exploit since at least July of 2021, 2 years ahead of their mass exploit campaign. That's quite a thing to think about, really. So let's put that into perspective with some of the other attacks that they were performing over the years prior. So in December 2020, bearing in mind this is after a number of members of the CLOP gang had been arrested, CLOP chose to exploit a Celion to exfiltrate data and extort victims. And those postings affected dozens of organizations, and those postings on their dark web blog continued into 2021. In July of 2021, we saw from looking at the data we'd collected from our MOVEit investigation that CLOP were likely developing or starting to develop an exploit for MOVEit, at least showing very careful attention to MOVEit applications. Nevertheless, soon after this, in 2021, in September, CLOP attacked SolarWinds ServU instances using a vulnerability that was published in July of that year. So, a few month lag in terms of the exploit development there, but nevertheless very, very quick to change tactics and move on that potentially very lucrative vulnerability that they saw, and then yes, of course, use that in a successful campaign throughout September. In 2022, we observe a lull in CLOP campaigns, but nevertheless found more evidence that year there were more attempts to exploit MOVEit. More testing was ongoing. One of the reasons there could be a significant lull in that time is that they're just spending the money that they'd made on the years previous. And then we get to 2023, which is a very active year for the group. Between January and February, the group were exploiting a vulnerability in Fortress Go Anywhere MFT. Following that, in April, Microsoft linked the group to attacks on papercut instances. It's worth noting in both of these cases, CLOP weren't the only group exploiting those vulnerabilities, but they did impact a number of organizations. And then in May of 2023, the automated activity begins targeting MOVEit servers. That campaign of activity took place over the Memorial Day weekend, and then, as we discussed in June, CLOP started to post victims to their dark web blog. So I'm going to hand it over to Scott now to give us a deep dive into the MOVEit campaign and some mitigation actions. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it. So one of the things that we've noticed is that the data extortion has become a really lucrative business. that they no longer have to encrypt software and do the double extortion tactics. The threat actors are actually getting the bang for their buck, or they're getting paid off of simply leveraging data exfiltration and then ransoming that data back for payment. We've also seen that it's a more simplistic chain of attack, meaning they don't have to have that complex ransomware encryption portion. And for the cloud on the back end, they're actually leveraging cloud resources so they can scale to the width of whatever they need to pull that data out and still have that data to be able to ransom it back. So they're changing their tactics based on the current landscape and simplifying that model to get paid with less effort. So when we look at engagements, and we're talking about the lessons learned, and we start looking at what Kroll uses, is we use the Kroll intrusion lifecycle to map out what threat actors do. This is a pattern that we've seen across thousands and thousands of engagements of the way threat actors gain access to something and then leverage that access for whatever their mission execution is. So the initial exploit, it could be a phishing email, it could be a malware dropper, malicious ad, zero-day vulnerability, really something that gives them some small window foothold into whatever the environment is that they are trying to look at. We also see after that, there's some initial scouting. They want to know, where am I? How many computers do I have? Do I have do I have 10,000 endpoint network? Do I have an 8 endpoint network, right? They want to know where they are, what they found. The toolkit deployment. The next phase they're going to do is they're going to drop in some tools that are going to assist them in their goals, right? This can be Cobalt Strike. This can be AnyDesk. This can be really any of the tooling that we see them drop into networks, and it could be malicious, and it could be simply a tool that is commonly used among IT teams. They're going to move from there once they build out that bulkhead a little bit larger. They have their tools in the environment. We're typically going to see some form of privilege escalation or privilege collection. So they're looking for the credentials. For a network service, they're looking for those domain admin credentials. Anything that's going to get them the keys to the kingdom, that's what they're looking for, as then they start to move laterally from their initial beachhead with the credentials they've collected to start identifying file servers, to start identifying SharePoint sites, to start identifying all the places where the organization stores data, and then really where they store their sensitive data. That's what they're looking for. Mission execution is simply going to be, for some actors, for the actors that are the single extortion, really a data extortion type thing, they're looking to exfiltrate that data, and then they're looking to email or send messages or some way to get their attention to enter into negotiations. For a ransomware threat actor that uses the double extortion tactic, it's going to be take data and then ransomware encrypt that data. When we look broadly across the 50+ MOVEit compromises, what we saw was that CLOP automated 4 of these methods. They automated initial exploit, toolkit deployment, escalation, and mission execution all in one script. Okay, so what we see is we see that initial exploit of when they leverage that guest access.aspx file, and then the toolkit deployment was they dropped a web shell, human2.aspx. They dropped human2.aspx on every box. There wasn't a differentiation in ASPX names, simply because it was an automated script that did the same thing every time, which was very different from when we saw proxy logon or proxy shell, and we had a lot of different names that are the web shells that were different simply because we had different threat actors that were trying to leverage these exploits. Here, very consistent fact pattern from beginning to end of a scripted attack from CLOP. Once they had that web shell on the box, then their privilege escalation was simply they attached to an admin account or created their own admin account. Now that was a MOVEit admin account. That wasn't a Windows an admin account, wasn't a domain account. It was a specific to MOVEit. And then they leveraged either the account they made or the account they attached to. They used that to exfiltrate data. All of that was a very automated process the shortest amount of time we've seen from beginning to end was 15 minutes. On average, you're talking about an hour, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours to get from initial exploit to simply data leaving the environment, with the earliest being 15 minutes. That is much faster than the ransomware actors we've seen. Historically speaking, I think a couple of years ago, the average dwell time was 2 to 3 weeks. Here in 2022, 2023, we've seen threat actors moving a lot quicker to get to that end goal, and we have an average dwell time of 2 to 3 days, right? When we have a threat actor that we see that has a dwell time of 15 minutes from initial exploit to data exfiltration, that is very consistent with an automated scripted attack, and they're looking to grab that data and then extort someone for that data. Okay. When we talk about the data exfiltration methods, Kroll observed 2 methods that they use to exfiltrate data. One of the methods was the 95 percentile method, meaning we saw it used broadly across really most all of our engagements. They simply drop the web shell through SQL injection, and then they're either going to inject a new session as a super user for an act and create an active session, or if they could not identify a super user, they would simply create their own super user and establish a session. Once that session is established, it's set for duration infinite, and that session is simply no longer requires authentication. So for instance, it does not require MFA, it doesn't require any type of authentication in the beginning, simply because they can use that session to then exfiltrate data. And what we saw, that 4th step, is they simply attached to the session and then started pulling the files that session had, that super user had access to. And in most of the cases, the super users are going to have access to a broad amount of files. There were a small percentage of cases where we saw a slightly different tactic for exfiltrating that data. So very similar beginning, they dropped the web shell through SQL injection. They're going to inject either a new session into an active admin, or they're going to create their own admin. After that, though, what we saw is we saw them passing 3 variables in. They were either passed organization ID or file name to pull individual files from that database. Now, when they were doing this, when they were actually having to call individual files with the information to get those files. A little bit different. We did see that, in most of the cases was done in the first method. Really, that's an indication that the second method was slower. Likely they looked at that and said, hey, these between the 2 methods, the second one is slower. We're not getting as much data as quicker, and then simply pivoted to only using the first method and use that broadly throughout their engagements. When they are using these methods, it's really important to note that the MOVEit encrypts the data at rest. So the files on a MOVEit server are actually encrypted at rest. The key is stored in the database. So on both of these methods, on the first method, when they try to pull that file, they're using an active session. So it's actually calling all of the APIs that MOVEit normally does to grab the file, decrypt it, and then provide the decrypted file. So on their end, they're actually grabbing the decrypted file. When on the method 2, they're actually having to call the actual API calls to ensure the database has all the information to grab the file, decrypt the file, and send the file. If they just pull the file, they're going to get an encrypted file. So on that second one, they actually had to leverage each of the APIs. So seeing how they're injecting these super users, seeing how they're actually calling the proper APIs, in case they had a very, very good knowledge of the inner workings of the MOVEit application. Okay. Did see a question pop in. I'll address it while we're on this slide. It said the creation of MOVEit account, was it consistent with all MOVEit cases you investigated? Yes. Remember, it is an automated attack, automated script that's doing that. It was very consistent with how they were creating that account. Why such a big impact? So we got to remember it's an automated attack. so they can actually take broadly from a lot of victims, right? So a lot of victims in this case. We also noticed it was very fast from beginning to end. So the data exfiltration rate in this case we saw was actually 100%. We did not find a client that was able to not have data exfiltrated. Since that data exfiltration was what we call trivial, meaning was built into the script, what we found was that the data that was stored on these MOVEit servers was not the similar type of data you'd have on file servers. On a file server, you have all types of data from a business. Some has sensitive data, some has not sensitive data, some might be publications, articles, might just be a working space for people to have files, right? And so when you have a file server, there's lots of different types of data. On these MOVEit servers was really heavily laden with sensitive information, because because businesses had some business-to-business operation where they were taking their sensitive data, storing on these servers to send it, meaning these servers were used for the most sensitive data they had. So when the threat actor gained access to it and started pulling data, they're only pulling data that has a lot of sensitive data elements in it. So that's a density of PII and PHI and financial information was actually a lot more significant than normally we have, simply because the application itself was used to transmit that sensitive information. All right, and then when you take that depth of information and then the breadth of the attack, that's when you have just a significant amount of information leaving that is a lot more than when we see in other engagements. So when we have an incident response, and we really want to highlight the difference between two different types of incident response. One is an organization that has a MOVEit server that has data on that server, and they're using that MOVEit application to send the data. The other thing, the other one we're going to look at is when I'm not necessarily the one that has the MOVEit server, but a business that has data on somebody else's MOVEit server, meaning they interact with a business that has their data on the MOVEit server. So on the first one, we have a very standard incident response. This is when a business has a MOVEit server, and then they have their own data on the server, and they're transmitting that data to their clients. You have an incident response. You have crisis communications, meaning we know that something's going to happen. We need to communicate with our customers and our partners to let them know what is happening, and then also engage from some negotiation services, right? CLOP posted a message that said that they're not going to send you emails, they're not going to let you know. You need to reach out to them. So the only way to get information about what was taken or what information was negotiation services. So we did see a really high rate of use of negotiation services in these MOVEit incidents. You're also going to need litigation support, meaning you have to understand what the legal requirements are for the data that you have and how it was compromised. And so all of these pan into these investigations. And then ultimately you're going to end up, since we did see really high relevant of presence of sensitive data, most of them are going to have some type of breach notification and some identity monitoring. And this was very consistent across all of our cases where we have a business that has a MOVEit server and their data is on the MOVEit server, they're sending their clients. Now, there's another incident, and of course, you're going to have some recovery and hardening to make sure that this doesn't happen again. When you have a entity that has data on someone else's MOVEit server, very similar fact pattern. The only thing you're losing is recovery, hardening, and litigation and negotiation services. You're not going to negotiate with the threat actor because it's someone else's data, someone else's server. But the fact of the matter is, you're still going to have crisis communications because your data is out there on the dark web. You're going to have engage some litigation support to understand what is your legal requirements for your data that was exposed. Also with breach notification, identity monitoring, those are all going to be part of that process. So we had actually a very similar on the investigations, was very similar between the people that had MOVEit servers and the businesses that had data on someone else's MOVEit server. Okay, minimizing impact. Really, I want to be real clear. We're not talking about preventing data exfiltration. We're not going to look backwards with hindsight 2020 and say if we would have done ABC, we would have prevented it. We did not have anyone that actually prevented data exfiltration. What we're talking about is minimizing that impact. And the analogy that I use is, we all drive cars, and there's tons of things that we have on the roadways that prevent accidents. Stop signs, stop lights, yellow lines, white lines, and all the different traffic controls that we use to prevent accidents, but we're never going to prevent all of the accidents. An accident is going to happen. And so what someone invented was seat belts and airbags, but say, hey, when an accident happens, we're going to minimize the damage of that impact. And that's really what we're learning from these MOVEit cases. And one thing Kroll is trying to really speak to is the fact that accidents are going to happen. It's not an if, it's a when. And what we need to be thinking about is, I have all these good protections in place. What do I have in place to minimize the damage when an incident happens? And one of the ways through monitoring, endpoint detection response, network detection response. We also have user behavior analysis in SIMs that can, look at what is going on and how people are using their accounts. All of those are really good methods for identifying that activity early and cutting that activity off. We did not, with the people that had endpoint detection and response in place, did not prevent the MOVEit exploit, but they did catch it early. We had some people that caught that data exfiltration within 30, 45 minutes, right? And then we're able to stop that, and they did not have a day or two of exfiltration in the cases where we saw the people that didn't have endpoint detection and response. So even though they weren't able to prevent it, they were able to mitigate it and reduce the amount of damage that was controlled, that was their impact. Also, the data that is up there, really having a managed file transfer service is not the same as a storage solution, right? Storage solutions are file servers and internal servers. This data transfer portal needs to be a data transfer portal and not a file repository, right? The important things is to set limits, set guidelines, set rules for when data is expired, when it's going to be removed off that server. What's the duration that data needs to be up on the server, right? Some clients may need the data up there longer. Some might have a very short duration, meaning they need to upload it for about 2 or 3 days and then pull it down so that data is not up on the server. We need to think of it as that moving data from point A to point B, not really storing that. And what we found is some of the organizations that had the largest impact were the ones that was more of a fire and forget. Put the data up on the server, have it there. It's available to be transferred, which is convenient. But then when that accident happened, all of that data was in a position to be copied. Putting some type of policy in place to restrict the amount of data that's on these servers actually can help mitigate that. And that's really one of the things that we really want to harp on, is the fact that we need to think about that when an incident happens, not necessarily if an incident happens. Okay. All right, now I do see we have a few questions piling into the portal. I'll start. Let's see. We said that in your experience, were organizations able to prevent exfiltration using software? So no, they were not able to prevent that data exfiltration. They were only able to catch it early and then mitigate that. All right. Also have do you have visibility into the directory structures that were exfiltrated, and as in, is it a one-to-one clone of how the data was stored on the MOVEit, or is it lumped together in bulk single archive? So what we saw was when the threat actors used this second method, a lot of times that they would actually take that data, compress it on the MOVEit server, and then send it out. For the data exfiltration, the open session, really it was a fire and forget. They literally pointed at the directories and said, go, and just let the MOVEit server itself handle that data exfiltration. And so it really became a one-to-one broadly across that 95 percentile. We just saw it was a one-to-one replication from the MOVEit server up to CLOP's cloud storage. Okay. Looks like we have another question is, was the data on the MOVEit server typically to be transferred or already transferred? Is one less than the data already transferred or already received removed from the MOVEit server? absolutely, that's one of the key takeaways here, is that data that has been transmitted or transferred, or that is up for a duration of time that is needed, be removed from the data server, and that proper data pruning is something that can reduce that risk later on. When we were doing these investigations and when we are looking at that database, we could see which data had been transferred. We didn't necessarily do the analysis to understand which data had been transferred, which data was up there. Really, the goal was to identify the data at risk. So I can't really tell you, whether or not someone had been transferred. I can say that some of the data that we saw on the servers did go back for quite some time and probably would have expired out of a portal if there was some policies in place. Okay. How could EDR prevent this? So I want to be really clear, EDR, endpoint detection and response, is not going to prevent this attack. This is a 0-day where they are leveraging the infrastructure in place to execute an attack. However, EDR is very good at catching and identifying that activity early. And the people that we saw that had EDR and NDR in place were able to identify that suspicious activity, and then were able to cut off that transfer and cut off that activity. One of the activities that we saw them catch was the web shell. When a web shell drops and is called, that web shell is actually compiled into a binary DLL on that server, and that is actually executed from there. So a lot of the EDR tools were able to catch the execution of that DLL as an executable, understand, hey, this is not normal, for a team to respond and look into it and say, this is not part, this human2.aspx is not part of the application, has a recent creation date, terminate that session. But again, that's not a prevention, that does take some time. The other thing we saw is people that had user behavior monitors in place were able to identify, hey, we have this one account that is now starting to transfer a lot more data than they should be transferring. Look into that session, identify it as odd, remove it from, remove that server from transferring the data. And so they were able to catch it early. But I'm really clear, in none of these cases was someone able to prevent the activity or prevent the transfer of that data before it occurred. Okay. Would encryption at rest and using a private key to decrypt minimize the impact? So MOVEit is actually an application that is used and is approved for government use. It uses encrypted data at rest. So the files that are on the MOVEit server placed there, they are encrypted, and there is a key, a private key that is stored in the MOVEit database that is used to decrypt that data. So what happens to the MOVEit server when there is a session and someone logs in and says, transfer me this file, the file is then taken, the MOVEit application decrypts that file and sends the user the decrypted file. Okay, so the MOVEit takes care of that. So what the threat actors had to do is they actually had to know the API calls to be able to do that manually. But what they found was by letting the MOVEit application do all that decryption for them, they could actually get that data out quicker. Now, if there was some other layer of encryption, absolutely. So if you took a file, wrapped it in your private key, stored it on the MOVEit server where it was encrypted with the MOVEit server's key, transfer that data, yes, the client would get it in the encrypted state. However, you would have to transfer the key to the client to be able to decrypt that data. And that's really above and beyond what you would consider normal or expected. Would it be, when we get in these engagements, when we find these servers, there's always a tug of war between convenience and security. The most secure computer is one that's not connected to the internet. It's absolutely secure. It's going to prevent any type of unauthorized access to the computer, have it access, not access the internet. And I know that Stuxnet, and people can say that's not as secure as well. Yes, but it is more secure than a computer connected to the internet. It's just not very convenient or helpful to use. And so in the MOVEit servers, it does have encryption at rest, and it does have a way to decrypt that in a way that if someone gained access to the MOVEit server and stole the files, they would be encrypted. But in this case, they were actually leveraging the proper calls to decrypt those on the fly. And so that's why that data left in the decrypted state. Okay. Looks like we have another question that says, how did MDR play a role in the customers that had it versus the customers that did not? So the customers that had EDR, MDR in place were able to identify and react quicker than the teams that did not. All right. So remember this actually happened over a weekend, Memorial Day weekend to be specific. So you have a lot of teams that are disengaged, a lot of teams that are spending time with family, a lot of teams that have a skeleton crew, minimal crew on, right? Even though you know the team is away, the employees that had MDR in place and a 24-hour monitoring SOC that would respond to alerts were the ones that they were able to identify it, react, be able to quarantine that server, isolate that server, take that server down, however they chose to respond. But the MDR and EDR tools were the ones that were generating those alerts, and of course any type of end user behavior analysis type program. When that SOC was able to alert it, they were able to say, hey, we're going to isolate that and take care of that early. And so even though CLOP got all the way through to mission execution and started exfiltrating data, they saw a lot less data leave their environment than the teams that didn't have MDR, EDR in place, and simply CLOP was able to sit there and exfiltrate data from Saturday, Sunday, Monday, all the way, and then Tuesday people come in and find out, hey, there's an email from Progress, we're something bad, right? All right, how did you see evidence of target enumeration between July 21st and July 23rd? Okay, so MOVEit application actually has two components. You have a back-end database component, and you actually have a front-end web server. So those are the two pieces that we were able to pull. So when we actually do MOVEit analysis, we would actually grab the server, or actually grab a backup of the database, and then grab the actual front-end web server. When we get that web server, that's going to have IIS logs. Traditionally, they were Windows servers. The bulk of the MOVEit servers we saw were Windows. That's going to have IIS logs, Internet Information Services, there's web logs. Some of those servers that we had, and of course, you're talking about 50 plus MOVEit investigations here. I can't even tell you how many servers we saw. Each investigation was between 1 and I think 13 servers was our largest one. We're getting a lot of visibility, historical visibility from those IIS logs. And what we were able to see is back in 2021, we saw a lot of failed requests to different ASPX files. So not guest access.aspx, meaning they're looking for the ones they can look, and we see them, trying to get in a lot of different types of ASPX files, a lot of JavaScript files. They're calling them a lot of different ways, all the normal ways that we see threat actors doing this, except the source IP addresses. Looking backwards, we were able to see that those IP addresses were connected with CLOP. So we know this was actually CLOP. This wasn't actually somewhere at the time, even though at the time, it just looks like the normal internet scanning that you see broadly. Whenever you attach something to the internet and has an open interface, it's gonna get some type of scanning, probing type of activity. Looking backwards, we could identify those IP addresses as CLOP and realize that that was CLOP in 2021. By April 2022, what we saw was them actually calling guest access.aspx and passing in a very specific variables that were very consistent with it. The actual exploit is a chain of 6 calls that gets them what they want. What we saw was by April 2022, we saw them calling the first couple calls and then returning the organization ID. All right, and what the analogy that I use when I talk to attorneys and clients on calls is essentially by August 2022, if we think about bank robbers, or not bank robbers, but but home burglars are in our houses. Essentially, in 2021, they were trying to figure out a key. By 2022, they had a key to all the locks. And they would simply walk up to a door, twist the doorknob, realize it worked, let the doorknob go, and walk away, knowing that they could come back and enter through the door when they want. And from April 2022 all the way up until the MOVEit attack, really up into a week or two before the attack, we see them using the same technique. Go in, turn the doorknob, realize it works, back out, likely testing and developing their automation scripts for making it all work. And then really on May the 27th was when we saw them go in, open the doorknob, walk in, and then leverage that access across the board. And that's really when we saw them then using it broadly. Okay. Are you seeing similar TTPs used in attacks in companies using Progress as WSFTP? Not sure about that question. George, do you have any information on similar TTPs from MOVEit and then Progress Software's WSFTP?
Yeah, I think that the two vulnerabilities are slightly different, right? So say sure, it's made by the same people. It performs similar functions. I've only worked one WSFTP case, and it's yeah, apples and oranges. I'm afraid in that particular instance, I don't think the cases that I've worked I would attribute to CLOP, if that's what you're asking.
Great, good deal. Looks like we have another question for George. So what is the highest ransom demand that we've seen across the MOVEit engagements?
Yeah, so I think we've seen demands in excess of 200 million. Whether they were paid or not, can't really comment, but yeah, 200 million. Sorry, 20 million. My apologies, 20 million.
Gotcha. Appreciate it there. All right, any other questions? It looks like we're getting close on time. All right, looks like we are close on time for today. Really big thank you for everybody that's taken time to tune in and join us today. Really hope you found it an informative session. So when you're leaving the briefing, if you could do us a favor, you're gonna be directed to a short survey. If you could spare a few minutes, we'd really appreciate if you could give us your thoughts on the session, really help us prepare for future sessions. Really appreciate everyone joining today. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully everyone has a good rest of your day, and hope to see you again on the future briefing.